Reese Williams never imagined a stolen motorbike would cost him his life. Layla didn't expect a simple walk through Camden's market to turn deadly. And Noel Mears, quiet, unassuming and unseen, held the strings to a violent feud that would tear the heart of the city apart. This is the story of Britain's most ruthless cycle of street revenge, where betrayal, bloodshed, and a hidden mastermind changed everything. In late summer 2019, Camden town was its usual blend of chaos and charm. Tourists wandered through the markets, camera flashes bounced off walls covered in graffiti art, and the smell of fried food drifted down the streets. But behind the color and noise there was a quiet tension growing in the local estates, a tension that would explode within weeks. It started with a motorbike. A brand new Yamaha R6, parked just outside a boxing gym on Kentish Town Road. Sleek, fast, and impossible to miss. It didn't stay parked for long. Within minutes, it was gone. Hot-wired and taken by a 17-year-old known only as Mace, a rising face in the Chalk Farm Lads, one of Camden's most unpredictable street crews. For him, the theft was a petty win, an act of ego. For others, it was an act of war. What Mace didn't know, or didn't care about, was who the bike belonged to. The owner was a senior figure in a rival gang, the Kentish Bloodline. Older, more organized and known for never letting a slight go unpunished. The motorbike wasn't just transport, it was a symbol, a message of wealth and dominance. Its disappearance was an insult that couldn't be ignored. Within 48 hours, Mace was found alone, walking near Queen's Crescent Market. A group of masked teens jumped from a parked car, armed with metal poles and a single claw hammer. They didn't stab him, they didn't shoot him, they beat him, deliberately, savagely, and publicly. When they left him bleeding in the street, someone sprayed a message on a nearby wall: "You touched the wrong wheels." The video of the attack surfaced online the same night. Grainy, filmed from a phone, it showed Mace's body twitching on the pavement while the attackers drove off laughing. The video was edited with slow-motion replays and drill music playing over the footage. It spread fast. Within hours, rival gangs, schoolmates, and even locals had seen it. The caption was simple: "Don't touch what's ours." That video changed everything. In the world of Camden's youth crews, where ego and territory mean more than money, humiliation is fuel. Retaliation wasn't just expected, it was demanded. The younger gang members looked to their older peers for leadership, but no one seemed to be in control anymore. It was no longer about a bike. It was about respect, and in this world, respect was built in blood. Unknowingly, Camden had just witnessed the first spark of something far bigger, something that wouldn't be stopped by a police patrol or a school assembly. The cycle had begun. Just days after Mace was brutally beaten, the violence showed it wasn't going to stop. Tensions between the Chalk Farm Lads and the Kentish Bloodline grew like wildfire, feeding on fear, anger, and the desire for revenge. Camden streets, once busy with daily life, began to feel colder, darker, and more dangerous. A 16-year-old named Jamal, a trusted member of the Kentish Bloodline, became the next victim. He was walking home from school one chilly evening, alone and unsuspecting. The route he took was familiar, a shortcut through a narrow alley between two council blocks. But that day something was waiting for him. As Jamal turned the corner, a group of figures emerged from the shadows. They were young, armed, and relentless. Before he could react, one of them lunged forward with a sharp knife. Jamal felt the blade slice into his leg, and then a second cut across his calf. Panicked, he tried to run, but a third stab caught him in the back. The attackers fled quickly, disappearing into the maze of streets and back alleys. Jamal lay bleeding in the alleyway. His desperate calls for help were finally heard by a passerby who called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and rushed him to the hospital where doctors worked to save his life. Though Jamal survived, the injuries left him unable to walk properly for months. Police arrived on the scene but found little to go on. The attackers wore masks, and the alley had no CCTV cameras. Witnesses who lived nearby claimed they didn't see anything or were too afraid to speak. In Camden's gang culture, silence was common. Loyalty to your crew meant never snitching, no matter what. But the message was clear to everyone. The Chalk Farm lads had struck back hard. The stabbing sent shockwaves through the community. Parents worried for their children. Schools held emergency assemblies warning students about gang violence. But the gangs themselves weren't concerned about public opinion. They were locked in a deadly battle that had become personal. No one could say for sure who would act next, or how far they would go. The line between victim and attacker blurred, as every attack demanded a response. Every wound begged for revenge. It was no longer just a fight over stolen property, it was a brutal war for pride and survival. As Jamal recovered, in hospital, Camden's streets grew tenser. More young people started carrying knives for protection, and small groups gathered late at night, looking for trouble. The stabbing was a clear sign. The violence wasn't random. It was organized. It was planned. And it was far from over. By October 2019, Camden streets had changed beyond recognition. What had started as a theft and a stabbing had now spiraled into violence so public and brazen that no one could ignore it. The fear was no longer confined to the gangs. It had spread to innocent bystanders, families and even children playing in parks. One afternoon, the violence took a terrifying new turn. A teenage girl named Layla, believed to be dating a member of the Chalk Farm lads, was walking through a crowded Camden market. The sun was shining, and the street was busy with shoppers and tourists. Without warning, two people on a moped sped past her, firing shots from a handgun. Layla was hit in the shoulder, but she survived. The real tragedy was that her 8-year-old cousin, standing just a few feet away, wasn't so lucky. The child was struck by a stray bullet and fell to the ground, unconscious and bleeding. Panic erupted as people scrambled to help. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but the shock rippled far beyond that moment. The shooting was a terrifying sign that the gang feud was no longer contained within the crews themselves. Violence was now spilling over into public spaces, putting anyone in Camden at risk. Residents who had once felt safe walking their dogs or shopping after work now crossed the street to avoid certain areas. Some shops closed earlier. Parents began holding their children's hands tighter, anxious about what the future might hold. Schools were deeply affected. Teachers reported students arriving frightened and distracted, some carrying small knives or pepper spray for protection. A number of schools introduced security measures, like metal detectors and increased staff patrols. Many students skipped classes, afraid to travel to and from school. Staff meetings focused less on lesson plans and more on safety drills. Despite all this, many people remained silent, unwilling or afraid to speak to the police. Trust between Camden's communities and law enforcement had been frayed over years, and the violent feud only made it worse. Some feared retaliation if they reported what they saw. Others simply didn't believe the police could protect them. The shooting marked a turning point. It was no longer just about gangs fighting each other in secret corners of the city. It was about innocent people caught in the crossfire. About the streets of Camden becoming a battlefield in broad daylight. For the first time, the wider public truly understood the scale of the problem. But even as police promised to crack down, the gangs continued their deadly cycle, pushing Camden deeper into chaos. The question on everyone's mind was simple but terrifying. How far would this violence go? As the weeks passed, the violence between the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline escalated beyond anything Camden had seen before. What started as isolated attacks turned into a relentless wave of destruction, hitting every corner of the community. No place felt safe anymore. The cycle of retaliation became vicious and unpredictable. One night, a bus packed with late-night passengers became a battleground. A group of young men armed with knives boarded the vehicle and attacked a rival gang member. Panic spread through the crowd as the victim was stabbed multiple times before others wrestled the attackers off the bus. The driver pulled over and emergency services were called, but the incident left passengers shaken and scared to use public transport. Not long after, a local shop, A small convenience store known for being neutral territory became the target of arson. A petrol bomb was thrown through the front window just after closing time, destroying most of the stock and leaving the building charred and unusable. The owner, a man with no gang connections, lost his livelihood overnight. Neighbors whispered about the message being sent. Nobody was safe, not even bystanders. Another shocking event unfolded when a gang member was chased into the Regent's Canal late one evening. The victim, panicked and injured, tried to swim across the water to escape. Witnesses later told police that he never resurfaced. His body was found days later, drowned and weighted down. Many believed this was a warning to others. The feud was deadly, and death could come in any form. In yet another brazen attack, a young man was cornered inside a barber shop in broad daylight. Customers and staff watched in horror as he was slashed multiple times by a group of masked youths. The attacker's swift getaway left the shop in shock, and the victim fighting for his life in hospital. The barber shop, a familiar and safe place for many locals, became another reminder of how deeply violence had seeped into daily life. The police were overwhelmed. Despite increased patrols and investigations, they struggled to keep up with the rapid pace of attacks. Witnesses were often unwilling to come forward, afraid of retaliation or distrusting the authorities. Cameras in some areas were disabled or vandalized, making it even harder to catch the perpetrators. Meanwhile, the gangs themselves seemed to operate with chilling organization. The attacks were no longer spontaneous outbursts, but carefully planned moves in a deadly chess game. Every action triggered a response, fueling the endless cycle. In the midst of this chaos, innocent people continued to get caught in the crossfire. Families who had nothing to do with gangs found their homes broken into or windows smashed as warning signs. Shops lost customers. Children stayed indoors. Camden streets, once full of life and energy, now echoed with sirens, whispers of fear, and the silence of those too afraid to speak. The war was no longer between gangs. It was a war that threatened the entire community. The killing of 16-year-old Reese Williams sent shockwaves through Camden and intensified the already brutal feud between the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline. Reese was a rising figure within the Kentish Bloodline, known for his sharp mind and fearless attitude. Despite his young age, he had become a symbol for his crew, a reminder that they would not back down. His death, in a violent stabbing outside a local park, was expected to trigger a wave of public outrage and retaliation. When the news spread, the gangs and the community braced themselves for an explosive funeral. Camden streets held their breath, waiting for the kind of ceremony that would become a rallying point, loud, angry, and public. In gang culture, funerals are often more than just a goodbye. They are declarations of power and defiance. The absence of one would be unusual, and even suspicious. But when Reese's family quietly arranged a cremation, held behind closed doors just 2 days after his death, many were left confused and uneasy. There was no public gathering, no large procession, and no display of defiance. The streets remained eerily calm. The funeral that many expected to ignite further violence never happened. This silence was not accidental. Behind the scenes, police investigations uncovered that a mysterious figure had been advising Reese's family to keep the funeral low-key. That person was his older brother, Tyler, who had been in contact with someone outsiders never expected, Noel Mears, a quiet 22-year-old man with no known gang ties. Tyler's decision to skip the traditional public funeral stunned the gangs and the wider Camden community alike. It was a decision that went against everything expected in their world. Detectives later learned that Noel had been quietly influencing events long before Reese's death. He had warned Tyler that a large public funeral would only serve as a target, a gathering of high-profile gang members that rival groups could attack. Noel insisted that keeping the funeral private was the only way to protect the family and prevent the situation from spiraling even further out of control. While some in the community viewed this as a sign of peace, the reality was darker. The absence of the funeral didn't signal an end to the violence. Instead, it marked a new, more dangerous phase. Without the expected outlet for grief and anger, tensions simmered beneath the surface, growing more intense and unpredictable. The usual cycle of revenge funerals and public showdowns was replaced by secret meetings, covert attacks, and an ever-deepening web of violence. Reese's death became a catalyst for a hidden war, waged away from the eyes of the public but no less deadly, and the quiet decision to avoid a public funeral was only the beginning of a more ruthless and calculated game, one that would drag Camden into darkness for years to come. As the violent feud between the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline continued to spiral out of control, a name began to surface quietly among police intelligence and community whispers. Noel Mears. Unlike the others involved in the violence, Noel was not known as a gang member, nor did he have a criminal record. In fact, to many who crossed paths with him, he seemed almost invisible, a quiet, unremarkable young man living on the edges of Camden's tough neighborhoods. Noel was 22 years old, living in a small, cluttered flat in Kentish town. He dropped out of school early and kept to himself most of the time. He was becoming more intense and unpredictable. The usual cycle of revenge funerals and public showdowns was replaced by secret meetings, covert attacks, and an ever-deepening web of violence. Reese's death became a catalyst for a hidden war, waged away from the eyes of the public but no less deadly, and the quiet decision to avoid a public funeral was only the beginning of a more ruthless and calculated game, one that would drag Camden into darkness for years to come. As the violent feud between the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline continued to spiral out of control, a name began to surface quietly among police intelligence and community whispers. Noel Mears. Unlike the others involved in the violence, Noel was not known as a gang member, nor did he have a criminal record. In fact, to many who crossed paths with him, he seemed almost invisible, a quiet, unremarkable young man living on the edges of Camden's tough neighborhoods. Noel was 22 years old, living in a small, cluttered flat in Kentish town. He dropped out of school early and kept to himself most of the time. He wasn't flashy, didn't wear gang colors, and had no known friends involved in the violent crews dominating the area. Yet, something about Noel didn't sit right with investigators. Over months of surveillance, they noticed his presence near multiple crime scenes linked to the gang feud. Phone data revealed a pattern. Noel's burner phone was active in the minutes before and after key violent incidents. He was seen near locations where attacks took place, yet he was never directly involved in any fights or arrests. Surveillance footage caught him casually walking through areas just hours before stabbings and shootings, then disappearing shortly after. What puzzled police most was his strange neutrality. He didn't belong to either gang but seemed to have access to both. Further investigation uncovered connections that helped explain his unusual position. Noel grew up in Camden and had childhood friends on both sides of the divide. His family ties spread across different estates and crews, giving him a unique perspective and access few others had. Yet he never joined any gang. Instead, he operated in the shadows. Detectives began to suspect Noel was more than just a bystander. He appeared to be a puppet master, carefully pulling strings from behind the scenes. Anonymous tips and intercepted messages suggested he was feeding false information to both gangs, sparking mistrust and provoking attacks. He was like a ghost, present but unseen, stirring up conflict without getting caught in the crossfire. What made Noel even more mysterious was how calm and controlled he seemed. Unlike the impulsive violence fueled by rage and loyalty that defined most gang members, Noel's actions appeared calculated, strategic. He was not driven by typical gang reasons, territory, respect, or money, but something else entirely. Police quietly ramped up efforts to monitor Noel, hoping to catch him orchestrating attacks. But he remained elusive, always one step ahead. To the gangs caught in the endless cycle of revenge, Noel was an unknown force shaping their fate. And as the feud grew bloodier, it became clear that uncovering Noel's true role would be the key to ending the violence that gripped Camden. The police raid on Noel Mears's flat came after months of careful surveillance and mounting suspicion. Officers expected to find weapons, drugs, or some clear sign of gang involvement. Instead, what they uncovered was far more disturbing and far more revealing. Noel's tiny living space was crammed with papers, photographs, and maps pinned to the walls, each carefully marked with red circles and notes. These were not random doodles, but detailed plans tracking the ongoing gang feud throughout Camden. The maps highlighted key locations, crime scenes, meeting spots, ambush points, and routes frequently used by both gangs. Alongside these maps were photographs taken covertly from a distance, images of gang members leaving homes, entering clubs, or meeting in secret. Detectives found a complex web of information, including phone numbers linked to both the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline, along with timelines that tracked when and where violent attacks had occurred. Noel had been watching and recording every move, every attack, every act of revenge, with almost obsessive detail. But more than just gathering information, it became clear that Noel was manipulating the feud. Intercepted text messages and social media accounts linked to him showed a pattern of deliberate provocation. He sent false tips to each gang, planting evidence and spreading rumors designed to stoke suspicion and mistrust. Sometimes he would leak information about supposed informants or betrayals, inciting rage and prompting violent retaliation. Police also uncovered evidence that Noel had hacked into social media profiles of gang leaders, posting fake messages to stir anger or confusion. In some cases, he orchestrated setups by arranging meetings where one side would be ambushed by the other, using burner phones and fake profiles to maintain his distance. Despite never holding a weapon himself, Noel's fingerprints were all over the conflict. He had become the unseen puppeteer behind Camden's street war, pulling the strings with chilling precision. Detectives realized they were dealing with a new kind of threat, not the usual impulsive violence driven by gang loyalty, but a calculated campaign of chaos engineered by a single individual working from the shadows. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. How could one quiet outsider wield so much power over violent, street-smart gangs? And how had he managed to avoid detection for so long? Noel's control over the feud raised deeper questions about the nature of the violence itself. Was the brutal cycle of revenge truly spontaneous, or had it been orchestrated from the beginning by someone determined to watch Camden burn? The answers lay ahead, but one thing was certain. Camden's street war was no longer just a gang fight. It was a carefully crafted nightmare engineered by a mastermind hidden in plain sight. As Noel Mears sat quietly in the interrogation room, police struggled to understand his true motives. He was calm, almost detached, as officers laid out the evidence, maps, photos, hacked messages and detailed plans showing how he had manipulated the violence between the Chalk Farm lads and the Kentish Bloodline. But when asked why he did it, Noel's answers were confusing, revealing a deeper and darker picture than anyone expected. Noel spoke about control, how chaos gave him power over Camden streets in a way no gang leader could achieve. He wasn't interested in joining a gang or seeking respect through violence. Instead, he wanted to prove something, that the whole system was fragile, broken, and easy to manipulate. To him, the feud was a game, a cruel experiment to watch how far fear, anger, and revenge could be pushed before everything collapsed. He talked about feeling invisible in his youth, ignored by the gangs and the community alike. Growing up on the margins, he watched friends get pulled into violence, either as victims or perpetrators, but instead of joining the chaos, Noel chose a different path, one of observation and manipulation. He studied the gangs like a scientist studying an experiment, learning how to exploit weaknesses, create distrust, and trigger violence getting his hands dirty. Noel described how small incidents, a stolen bike, a rumor, a late-night message, could spiral into deadly consequences when stoked by the right provocation. He explained how he carefully planted false information, knowing it would be believed, trusted, and acted upon. His aim was to watch the feud consume itself, tearing apart the community from within. When asked about the innocent lives caught in the crossfire, children like Layla's cousin, families like Reese Williams's, Noel's expression remained cold. He said their suffering was collateral damage in a larger game, a tragic but necessary price to prove his point about how fragile trust and order really were in Camden. This chilling detachment shocked investigators. Here was a man who had turned real pain and death into a twisted form of control, orchestrating a cycle of violence for years just to test how far it could go. He saw himself as outside the system, above the chaos he created. Yet, despite his claims of power and control, Noel seemed restless, as if aware that his carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. The more the police uncovered, the more fragile his position became. Noel's confession forced Camden's community and law enforcement to face a painful truth. The violence was not just the result of gang rivalry or youth anger. It had been a calculated, deliberate campaign led by someone who had weaponized revenge itself, turning the city into a battlefield for his own dark experiment. And the question that haunted everyone was this: how many more lives would be lost before the cycle finally ended? As the investigation into Noel Mears deepened, Camden's community grappled with a growing mix of disbelief and anger. How could one quiet, seemingly powerless man have sparked so much destruction? The revelations about Noel's role shattered the simple narrative of rival gangs fighting over territory. Instead, it exposed a far more complex and disturbing truth. Police began tracing the full extent of Noel's manipulation. His web of lies had stretched beyond the two main gangs, touching dozens of young people caught in the violence. Friends were turned against friends. Small disputes escalated into bloody confrontations, and innocent bystanders were dragged into a war they never wanted. Every stabbing, every shooting, every act of revenge carried Noel's fingerprints, even if no one realized it at the time. This realization left many residents feeling betrayed, not just by the gangs, but by the invisible force that had played them all like puppets. Parents who thought they understood the danger on the streets now faced a nightmare far more sinister. A calculated campaign to keep Camden divided and violent, led by someone no one suspected. Community leaders and local organizations intensified their efforts to rebuild trust and heal the wounds left by years of bloodshed. Schools introduced new programs focused on conflict resolution and mental health support. Outreach workers sought to connect with young people, offering alternatives to gang life and a way out of the cycle Noel had exploited. Meanwhile, the police faced their own challenges. Catching Noel had been a breakthrough, but dismantling the networks he manipulated was a complex task. Many gang members remained active, fueled by years of fear and mistrust. And though Noel's influence was significant, it was clear that the underlying problems, poverty, lack of opportunity, fractured community ties had allowed the violence to grow in the first place. Noel's trial became one of the most high-profile in Camden's recent history. Prosecutors portrayed him as a mastermind of chaos, a man who used manipulation and technology to orchestrate a reign of terror. Defense lawyers argued that Noel was a troubled young man, isolated and misunderstood, but ultimately not responsible for the gang's actions. The court battle was fierce, with the community divided between those seeking justice and those struggling to understand how it had come to this. In the end, Noel was convicted of multiple charges related to inciting violence, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His sentence was long, reflecting the devastating impact of his actions on Camden's streets. But even as Noel was locked away, the scars remained. Camden had been forever changed by a cycle of revenge that was more ruthless and calculated than anyone could have imagined. The question now was whether the community could finally begin to heal, and whether the lessons of this dark chapter would prevent such a nightmare from ever happening again. In the years following Noel Mears's conviction, Camden slowly began to rebuild itself from the ashes of the ruthless cycle of violence he had orchestrated. The streets, once dominated by fear and chaos, gradually found moments of calm. But the impact of the bloodshed left deep scars not only on the buildings and roads, but on the hearts and minds of everyone who lived there. The community faced a difficult journey toward healing. Families who had lost loved ones in the crossfire struggled to find closure. Young people once caught in the endless cycle of gang life and retaliation had to learn how to envision a future beyond violence. Schools and local organizations worked harder than ever to provide safe spaces and support systems, trying to break the patterns Noel had so brutally exploited. One of the most important lessons from the feud was how fragile community trust could be. Camden's residents realized that the violence wasn't simply a battle between gangs. It was a symptom of deeper problems: poverty, lack of opportunity, and a fractured social fabric. Rebuilding meant addressing these root causes, not just fighting the symptoms. The police, too, took stock. The investigation into Noel's manipulation forced law enforcement to rethink their approach to gang violence. They began working more closely with community leaders, investing in outreach programs aimed at prevention rather than punishment. Camden